Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you all very much for inviting me as an institution, I guess. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. It's also lovely to see lots of familiar faces from various points of my career in the west of Scotland, so thank you for that. I'm Sam, as you can see. I lead the undergraduate music degrees at the Conservatoire, and just to give you a bit of a sense of scale, I've got about 450 students. That's about a third of the students in the institution, which to some of you will feel quite big in terms of student numbers, to others might feel rather modest. And it's also, slightly surreal to be giving a keynote at a university learning and teaching conference. Will I have any insights worthy of the name? I fretted to myself when I was first invited. Well, look, don't worry, because most of us up at Renfrew Street have worked in universities too, so the challenges we face are broadly familiar. And we are part of the same great big sector too, aren't we? Higher education. Whew, okay, good. So now I've dealt with those most pressing of questions. Who on earth is this fraud, and what can he possibly tell us about university teaching? Well, I can hopefully relax back into my favourite fear, my favourite neurosis, and that is the fear of being unmasked as a hypocrite. Because one, as you know, I work at a conservatoire, and two, as you know, my chosen theme today is restraint. Well, look, I have to own up to you right now. Conservatoires and music colleges are perfect case studies in the very human tendency to add, accumulate, elaborate until the original purpose of whatever the thing is buried under layers of well-intentioned activity. But I hope that it's exactly that context that has made me think, well, quite deeply over several years now, about the practice of making space, of choosing what matters, of letting silence sometimes do some of the work. And I hope that these contemplations, that these mistakes that I've made and mistakes that I very much continue to make, well, I hope that this all qualifies me to some extent to be standing in front of you. And don't worry, this isn't going to turn into a Calvinist sermon, despite it being Holy Week. Restraint is very much the order of the day in the liturgical calendar at the moment, isn't it? I know, I'm a loss to the manse. But this idea, restraint as a form of care, is what I want to talk to you about today. Now, talking of Calvin, oh, blimey, where's he going to go with this? Talking of Calvin, I know that many of you are deeply involved in the scholarship of learning and teaching. Subtle. I mean, it's a thread that stitches the whole conference together, isn't it? So what I'm offering you today isn't a grand theory, but it's just a perspective from a slightly unusual corner of the sector. And I hope very much that we'll find that this perspective sits comfortably alongside your own experiences, because at the heart of what I'm saying today is practical wisdom. Practical wisdom, what Aristotle would have called phronesis, and how we use it in the messy human reality of teaching. And practical wisdom really matters, because we're all working in environments that are changing much faster than our systems can keep up with. I mean, was it ever thus? Students keep on arriving with diverse backgrounds, complex needs, and high expectations. And in turn, we're expected to be disciplinarians, pastoral carers, digital innovators, administrators, assessors, and very occasionally miracle workers. So the instinct, at least my instinct anyway, when faced with all of that, is to add more. More content, more choice, more support, more scaffolding, more documentation, more everything. But the trouble is, if everything is important, then nothing is. Students can't tell what to focus on, and neither can we. Confusion isn't a sign of intellectual richness, it's just confusion. So maybe inclusion, and real inclusion can be achieved not by adding more, but through better choices. perhaps the most humane thing we can do, we can give our students, isn't abundance, but clarity. Not a great big flood of information, but the skills to navigate what really matters. And that's the crux of what I want to talk to you about today. Pedagogical restraint. Not as austerity, we've had plenty of that in this country, thank you very much, but as a professional stance, a way of teaching and a way of being with students that makes space for them to think, to grow, to imagine themselves as the kinds of people and professionals that they might become. So to take us there, I'm going to start in my own context, the Conservatoire. Not because I think you should all adopt our practices, please don't do that, but because the intensity of our environment makes certain things very visible. It's like a pedagogical pressure cooker. If you turn your back on it for too long, something will probably explode, like a singing teacher's ego. And sometimes when you look at something under pressure, or you have a moment of profound burnout that forces you to step back from your own context for a second, and yes, I speak from personal experience, well, you start to see its structure a bit more clearly. You see it for what it is, the patterns, the habits, and the assumptions. That's certainly been true for me. Our students' days are full to the brim. So as staff, we're constantly making tiny decisions about what to prioritise. And that means the power of restraint is very visible. And nowhere is that clearer than in the most ordinary, everyday teaching encounter we have. So let me take you into one of those ordinary moments in my world. A one-to-one clarinet lesson. Now let's imagine that this particular teacher also happens to be principal clarinet in one of Glasgow's professional orchestras. So when a student walks in and plays something for them, they're not just hearing a piece of music, they're hearing a lifetime of training, 1,000 rehearsals, a career's worth of nuance. And every time the student finishes playing a phrase, the teacher has a decision to make. Because they could comment on 100 things, couldn't they? Of course they could. I mean, they're not just going to say, play it again, please, but this time, don't make any mistakes. I have heard somebody say that. Or as a Russian viola teacher once said to me, why you play it bad when you could play it good? I mean, what do you do to that? I said to him, shall I play it again for you? Yes. I must warn you, though, you're not going to like it. Different times. No, our clarinet teacher here is not going to do any of that. There's always something for them to say about tone, articulation, breath, phrasing, intonation, posture, expression, stagecraft. They could talk for an hour without repeating themselves. Some of them have. I've been in the room. But they don't. They can't. No, instead, they choose one thing. One thing that will make the biggest difference right now. And that, to me, is pedagogical restraint. This danger of overload, it's not because the teacher lacks expertise, it's because they have too much of it. And they know that if they try to say everything, the student will hear nothing. I think there's something quite beautiful about that choice. The expert holding back everything they could say so that they can offer the one thing that will actually be useful. And I think this is something that the scholarship of teaching tells us as well, that across disciplines, expertise can be a barrier as well as a resource. Now, of course, our clarinet student, he's making decisions too. Every time the student plays, they're choosing how to shape a phrase, what to emphasize, what to keep in the background. They're deciding which path to take and which to reject. And look, this is a principle that travels well beyond the conservatoire. Whether you're teaching clarinet, chemistry, criminology, critical theory, we're all making these micro decisions, aren't we? All of the time. What shall I say now? What shall I save for later? What shall I leave out entirely? Restraint, you see, isn't a lack of generosity. It's one of the most generous things we can do. It's the discipline of choosing the one thing that will help a student move forward rather than overwhelming them with everything we could possibly say. That choice, the one thing, is phronesis in action. It's our practical wisdom about what can unlock the next step for this student in this moment. And you'll notice in my talk today that this theme of the one thing keeps returning, because to me it's the simplest form of restraint, what matters most right now. And you know, when we think about inclusion, about students arriving with different levels of confidence, different prior knowledge, different ways of processing information, well, discipline on our part becomes even more important. Now, of course, as I say, this business of choosing what matters isn't just a conservatoire thing. Once you start noticing the pattern, the expert choosing the one high-impact thing, well, you start to see it everywhere. And sometimes we see it in places so familiar that we don't even notice. I've just shown you how this plays out in music teaching, in instrumental teaching, but it also turns up in the most ordinary of assessment tasks. Let's take the humble essay. Yes, my students write essays too. And every year, across every discipline, my students and your students might show us some draft work, and every year we all write the same kind of feedback. Narrow the scope, focus the question, depth, not breadth. Choose one case study and do it well. It's practically a liturgy, and ironically I've just made 4 points there that I could probably distill into just one. And what we're really doing in these moments is teaching a kind of scholarly rigour. I don't think it's abstemious or hyper-frugal. It's just discipline. The discipline of resisting the temptation to include everything they've ever read or thought or Googled or that a large language model has told them. Essentially, it's choosing a line of argument that's robust and letting go of the rest, bar maybe a couple of counter-arguments, of course. And we do this, we give this feedback because we all know intuitively that intellectual generosity isn't an exercise in quantity. It's about clarity. A well-chosen example is more generous than 10 poorly chosen ones. A focused question is better than a sprawling one. A single, well-developed idea gives a student more room to think than a dozen half-formed ones. In other words, restraint is already part of everything that we do. We just don't always call it restraint. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to talk to the person next to you, I promise. Let's restrain ourselves. But before we go any further, I just want to give you 30 seconds to think about something. I'd like you to try to recall a moment when you were learning something, recently or even years ago, and you felt completely overloaded. What did that feel like? And what would have helped you in that moment? Just hold that in your mind. Now, to bring us back to today's theme of inclusion, about students arriving with wildly different levels of confidence, different cultural expectations, different relationships to academic work, this becomes even more important. Because when we ask a student to narrow their scope, we're not limiting them. We're giving them a leg up. We're saying, just make a start. This is enough. And that principle, that enoughness, is something that I want us to hold on to now as we take a short trip to Loch Winnoch. Yes, we are going to step completely outside of my discipline now. In fact, we're going to step completely outside of the classroom of this wonderful building. Okay, now, if you were trying to teach somebody about bird watching, and I have some first-hand experience here, Spoiler, she's 15 now and not interested at all in bird watching. Fair enough. Sceptical Scottish teenager. Well, look, you would never start off by saying, okay, we're going to learn how to differentiate the various types of tit. That would be asking for trouble. Yeah? That would be dispiriting for the learner. That would create a sense of cognitive dissonance. What would you do? What might we do instead? Well, I think you'd probably start off by pointing out the easiest birds to spot. Yeah? The ones that are most different, most distinctive, maybe even the most available to you. You could say, look, this is a pigeon. We see those in the park all the time. This is a woodpecker with its sharp beak. This is a blackbird. The clue is in the name. This is a robin with its lovely red breast. I know, I'm also a loss to primary school teaching. And then you might move on to differentiating two broader groups. Let's say the tits and the finches. Now concentrate, everybody, focus. I want you to look at the beaks. Just focus on the beaks. The tits, they have thin little pointy beaks. You see those? Whereas the finches have thicker, bulkier beaks. Tits like to eat insects and small seeds, so their beaks are sharp and slender. Finches, they like to crack bigger husks and nuts, so their beaks are stout and conical, more robust. Sharp and slender beak. Which one? Tit. Yes, thank you. Let's try that again, shall we? Sharp and slender beak. Tit. Thank you. Stout and bulky beak. Great, okay. And now you know this information, it's time for us to play a quick game of tit or finch. Yeah, I've been spending far too much time with my drama colleagues, haven't I, clearly? Yes, the winter nights just fly by in my house, you can imagine. So which type is this? It's a tit, well done. How about this one? It's a finch. Finch, good. That's a tit. Yep. It's a finch. It's a tit. Yeah, that's a tit too. What about? Yes, it's a siskin, which is a type of finch, don't worry. And this one? It's a finch. There we go. And then, and only then, would we move on to more complex beak categories. Keep it clear. Keep it simple. As clear and as simple as you can get away with. Next time, know your crow. Don't worry, there is no next time. Now look, what is happening there? What's happening, apart from the obvious joy of a room full of adults shouting tit and finch before 11 o'clock in the morning? Well, you are enjoying the fruits of my excellent teaching, of course. That's what's happening. What's happening is that you're all experiencing the difference between clarity and overload, right? Between just one well-chosen distinction and several competing ones. Between a learning experience that I hope felt possible to you and one that feels impossible. As cognitive load theory reminds us, when learners are faced with too many competing distinctions, they don't learn faster, they simply run out of working memory. And yes, it's a contested field, and no, I'm not going to try and tease out every nuance today, but this does bring me to another arena in which this all plays out very vividly for me. When my students, who are already experts in their instruments, start teaching beginners. Because, as I say, my students, they're experts, they've spent years working with a musical language that now feels completely natural to them, and I have to say, nothing exposes the limits of that expertise quite like trying to explain the difference between an F sharp and an F natural to an 8-year-old. This is one of these classic concepts in music theory that's so often misunderstood by learners. We cannot assume that a pupil knows that an F and an F natural are the same thing. Okay? You know there's this thing called an F sharp And then there's this thing called an F, which we sometimes just call F, and sometimes we call it F natural. Oh, I'm so confused. Now at this point, your curious high-achieving learner might reasonably want to know, okay, what are the circumstances in which I add the word natural in order to clarify that I'm not talking about an F sharp? And that's before we even get on to the fact that F flat is kind of the same as an E, and an E sharp is kind of the same as an F, but technically they're not, in fact, quite the same functionally. But don't worry, people, because you probably won't ever encounter that, at least not for a few years. What? Yes, music theory is basically a long-running practical joke, but it's also full of what Meyer and Land would call threshold concepts, ideas that are conceptually troublesome until they suddenly click into place. And this is what happens when expertise meets innocence. The expert sees a beautifully coherent system. The beginner sees chaos. Yes, they might need some of that knowledge now. They might even need the space to play around with it for a bit. But the moment that an expert tries to explain everything, even with the best of intentions, the learner's cognitive load shoots through the roof. So what do we teach our students about teaching? Well, we teach them restraint, of course. We teach them to choose the one thing that matters right now. We teach them to hold back the elegant complexities of the system until the learner has a foothold. We teach them that clarity isn't dumbing down, it's what supports logical future learning. Quite often, teaching is as much about the stuff you choose to leave out. There you go. There's an Oliver Bonas down on Byres Road, isn't there? You can probably get this on a mug. But again, this isn't a conservatoire problem. It's a universal problem. You've all experienced this, I'm sure. Whether you're teaching biology or business, your students are grappling with concepts that feel completely obvious to you, but utterly alien to them. And the temptation, especially when you care, which your being here suggests very much that you do, the temptation is to over-explain, over-contextualize, over-provide. But inclusion often relies upon the opposite to that. We need to offer just enough to make the next step possible. We need to remember what it feels like not to know. Now, before I go any further, I do want to be very clear about what I'm not arguing for, because whenever you talk about restraint in education, people understandably start to worry. So let me offer you a few reassurances at this point. First, I'm not arguing for a monastic minimalism. I'm not suggesting that we all retreat to our offices, strip our modules back to 3 bullet points, and communicate only through meaningful silences, tempting though that sounds at the end of another long term. Second, I'm not arguing for a return to hyper-discovery learning, where students are expected to figure out everything for themselves, while we just hover in the background, radiating encouragement. You know, even at PhD level, that's not how learning works, and it's certainly not inclusive. Third, I'm not suggesting that we lower standards, or that we do less work, or that we take our work less seriously. In fact, restraint often requires more thought, more judgment, more care. It's much easier to throw everything at a student than to decide what they actually need. I wrote you a long letter because I didn't have time to write you a short one. I think that's Mark Twain, isn't it? And finally, I'm not pretending that my context is identical to yours. I have a certain kind of privilege in the Conservatoire. You know, when a pianist arrives, they already have years of learning in the bank. They've passed an audition, they've built a foundation. But even then, even with all that prior knowledge, restraint is essential. I know that some of your students might be quite different. You might be teaching the rudiments of biology to a student who's done no more than a crash hire. Your sociology students might have done Marx, Weber and Durkheim for A-level, but many probably haven't. You might be introducing concepts that are genuinely brand new. And so the temptation is to rush, to compress, to front load because time is short. If I don't tell them this now, they'll never catch up. If I don't give them all the information, I'm limiting them. But this is precisely where restraint becomes most important, because you know that when students are overwhelmed, they don't learn faster. They freeze. They retreat. They disengage. Inclusion isn't about giving students the whole system at once. It's about slowing down and giving them a way in. And there's a paradox that we also talk about quite a lot at the Conservatoire. Our students are incredibly busy. I've hinted at that. Packed timetables, hours of practice, part-time work, emerging professional identities. As far as higher education goes, the number of contact hours we have with them is unusually high. And so we spend, as a staff group, we spend quite a lot of time talking about what we can strip back or what we can remove entirely. But the irony is this: when we give them less, they often want more. And when we give them more, they often want less. There's no perfect equilibrium. All we can do is talk about what's enough in this moment for these learners in this context. And when we talk about inclusion, we often focus, quite rightly, on curriculum, assessment, feedback, support. But there's another layer sitting underneath all of that. It's a layer that students absorb constantly and often unconsciously, and that is a layer of role modelling. You see, restraint isn't something that it's not just something that we do, it's something that students see us do as well. And whether we intend to or not, we're always modelling something, I'm afraid. We model what it looks like to be a professional in our field. We model how to handle complexity. We model how to make decisions under pressure. We model how to prioritise, how to communicate, how to set boundaries. And students do watch us very closely. They watch how we respond to overload, how we talk about our work and our colleagues, how we treat ourselves, how we treat them. And in fact, as plenty of research has shown, students may even learn more from what we model than from what we say. I know, if my students use sources as old as these, there'd be hell to pay. Do as I say, not as I do. Ha ha. And by the way, the most interesting literature about role modelling in professional education tends to come from the field of medicine. There you go. If we model franticness, they learn franticness. If we model perfectionism, they learn perfectionism. If we model that the only acceptable academic is the exhausted academic, they will try to become that too. And some of them will break themselves in the process. But if we model clarity, focus, and restraint, if we show them that expertise includes the ability to choose what matters and let go of what doesn't, then they learn something far more valuable. They learn that being a professional is not about knowing everything. It's about navigating complexity with judgment and care. And that's where I think the discipline of enough can be more than a pedagogical technique. I don't want to come across as too grand, but it can even be an ethical stance. It can be a way of saying, your learning matters, but so does your well-being. The thing is, students don't just learn the content. They learn our habits. They learn our values. They learn our way of being in the world. And I'm sure that's what you did as undergrads from those that taught you. I mean, here you all are, like me, still in that world of higher education. And if we want our students to thrive in a changing environment, then modelling restraint, modelling enoughness, is one of the most powerful things that we can do. Which brings me on to the last part of my talk today, what it means to embed this discipline of enough into our systems, into our curricula, and into our everyday practice. Because we all know that individual restraint can only take us so far. You can be the clearest, calmest, most focused teacher in the world, but if your module descriptor reads like a novel, If your assessment strategy asks students to demonstrate mastery of 17 learning outcomes simultaneously, or if your course structure is more like a game of Jenga, then your students will still feel overwhelmed. So we need to start thinking systemically. And that starts with a deceptively simple question. What is this thing for? What's the purpose of this module, this assessment, this learning activity, this week of teaching? And crucially, what is it not for? When we redesign modules at the Conservatoire, I try to begin by asking, what's the one thing a student should be able to do at the end of this? I know, right? I've just described a learning outcome, but just the one. Not the 10 things we could list, not the 20 things we could imagine, the one thing that will make their biggest difference to their development right now. And once you know that, most of the rest becomes negotiable. This really isn't about lowering ambition. As I've said, it's recognizing that students don't need everything at once. They need the right things at the right time. And when we do this, when we strip away the noise, when we focus on what matters, when we build in space rather than stuffing every single corner, something quite interesting happens. Students don't learn less. They learn more deeply. They learn more confidently. They learn with more agency. And they start to model that same clarity in their own work. So embedding the discipline of enough isn't about austerity. It's about giving students the gift of focus, of clarity, of a learning environment that doesn't assume that more is always better. Now, I know that it's one thing to talk about restraint in the abstract. It's quite another to make it part of the everyday texture of teaching. But as the scholarship always reminds us, as the wonderful workshops at this conference will remind us, small, well-designed interventions often have the biggest impact. So let me offer you a few practical tips, nothing dramatic, nothing that needs a committee, just the kinds of things that we can all do to shape the learning environment. And the first of those is this: choose the one thing. This is the practical outcome of everything I've been saying to you about choosing. Before a class, before a meeting, before a feedback session, ask yourself, if they remember only one thing from this, what should it be? And then let that guide your choices. It's amazing how much noise falls away when you commit to one thing. Second, talk about your choices. Students don't just benefit from restraint. I think they really benefit from seeing you practice it. Say to them, there's lots of interesting directions we could go from here, but today we're just going to focus on this. It models judgment. It shows them that expertise includes the ability to prioritize. Third, design for breathing space. This might mean fewer texts, or shorter texts, or texts with a clear purpose. It might mean one really good example instead of 5. It might mean a week in the module where the cognitive load dips rather than spikes. Fourth, simplify the path. If a task has 6 steps, ask whether it really needs 6. If a learning outcome has 3 verbs, ask which one actually matters. If an assessment rubric reads like the Magna Carta, think about what it would look like if it were actually written for a human being, unless you're teaching medieval law, in which case, fair enough. Fifth, practice compassion. Students do notice how we work, and when we show them that it's possible to work with focus rather than frenzy, to say, this is enough for now, we give them permission to do the same. Now look, none of these tips is a grand gesture. They're small, deliberate acts. They're things that we can do despite institutional politics and dysfunction, because yes, all institutions are dysfunctional. But when you add these things up across modules, across courses, even across whole institutions, they create a learning environment that feels navigable, humane, and genuinely inclusive. If there's one thing I hope that you take from today, it's that inclusion isn't only about what we add, it's also about what we leave out. It's the discipline of enough content for students to build confidence, not collapse under complexity, enough space for them to think, to breathe, to grow, enough modelling from us to show that expertise isn't omniscience, but judgment. And the wonderful thing is, none of this needs a revolution. It doesn't need a new framework, or a new VLE, or a new set of institutional slogans, hashtag life's not a rehearsal. It starts with the smallest of decisions, the ones that you might make this afternoon, or next week, or next term. If we can do this consistently, compassionately, collectively, then we can create learning environments where students can flourish without drowning, and where we can teach without burning ourselves out in the process. Small actions rather than grand gestures. So my invitation to you is simple. Try it. In one class, in one conversation, in one piece of feedback. Practice the discipline of enough. See what happens. Notice what changes in your students and in yourself. In the end, teaching is an act of attention, and you've been very kind to give me so much of yours, but attention is finite, rather like the time I have for this talk today. So what we cling on to and what we let go of, well, that does turn out to be the shape of our teaching. And perhaps the most radical thing we can do in higher education is to trust that for this moment, for this learner, for this context, this is enough. Thank you.